It's The Big Take from Bloomberg News and iHeartRadio. I'm Wes Kosova. Today, just how safe is that money in your pension plan?
People around the country wake up every day wondering whether they've saved enough to provide for themselves and their families. Working a job that provides basic dignity, a good middle-class job you can raise a family on, a job that provides a dignified retirement and will give you peace of mind. But the reality is, for so many people, the goalposts keep moving.
Millions of Americans, including public employees and people working union jobs, are counting on a pension to provide them with a steady stream of income when they retire. But some corners of America's pension system have gotten a bit rickety. Pension plans can be underfunded or they underperform. And that's a problem even if you don't have a pension. Because when they get into trouble, sometimes the government has to step in and bail them out with taxpayer dollars. President Joe Biden, you heard just now, that's exactly what he did at the end of last year, giving $36 billion in federal funds to shore up a union pension plan. Why is this happening, and what can be done to fix it? My colleagues, Neil Weinberg, Suzanne Woolley, and Akyala Gardner are here to explain. Neil, Suzanne, Akyala, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
Likewise.
Thanks for having us.
Suzanne, let me start with you. Pensions have always been considered very safe. You didn't have to think about it. Your employer put away the money. When you retired, it was there for you. And yet, in recent years, both public pensions and pensions run by private companies have run into some pretty rocky terrain. Can you tell us just what is the general landscape of what's happening with pensions?
Sure. Sort of the holy grail of retirement for many people would be the defined benefit pension, because you get, a set amount of money every year for the rest of your life. It's guaranteed. That has largely gone by the wayside in the private sector and has been replaced by defined contribution plans.
The 401k.
Yes, your 401k. And 401ks are great, but the returns aren't guaranteed. And with the old defined benefit plans, they were managed by investment professionals, big pools of money. And now your 401k, you are all of a sudden expected to be the investment manager and handling all the risk for saving enough, and saving in the right things for your retirement. So there's been a lot more risk foisted onto individual retirees in America. And a lot of that safety and surety of a steady stream of income has been stripped away.
And pensions, of course, eliminated that risk because, as you say, the money would just be there. But Neil, you've just written a big story about public pensions and how the investment professionals who used to run pensions that Suzanne was just talking about have now been replaced in a lot of ways by amateurs.
Well, a lot of the pensions that serve state and local employees were set up around World War II, in some cases well before that. And it's usually in state law that says the people who are going to be the directors of these pensions are people who are rank and file members. These are state employees, teachers, policemen. They are government officials. They are members of the public, and they are chosen largely because they're members of these groups. They're not chosen because they know anything about investing. Over the last 20 years, these pension systems have gone from having a pretty plain vanilla sort of portfolio of investments. It was government bonds and common stock, to much more exotic things, private equity, hedge funds, private real estate. And the result is you have people who are not investment professionals who are overseeing a phenomenally complex multi-billion-dollar investment systems. And this is a huge mismatch, which leads to the question of, who's guarding the henhouse.
It's almost like it's parallel to the individuals who are now forced to manage, a lot of investments and risk and are sort of pushed into being their own investment manager. And they don't have any background in this either.
One of the really interesting things we were talking about recently is the fact that if you want to invest in some of these so-called alternative assets as an individual, you need to be an accredited investor, meaning you have to have a certain net worth or a certain financial sophistication as deemed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The people who are overseeing these multi-billion-dollar pension systems are not, in many cases, accredited investors. They couldn't buy this stuff for their own portfolio, for their own retirement, but they're buying it for tens or hundreds of thousands of people.
And what is an example of these alternative investments?
This would be private equity or hedge funds. It could be private real estate. It could be something else that is exotic, so-called real assets.
Yes, things like that. One of the key aspects of these investments is that they're opaque and they're not sort of easily tracked by the average individual. And also they tend to be more expensive than more standard investments. And that raises the question of, are you getting a much higher return for that investment that you're paying a lot of money for?
Well, critics would argue that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on and the returns are not really that good. Supporters would say you get what you pay for, although some people in the investment community say you get what you don't pay for in terms of expenses.
So the upside is you can make a lot of money, big return on these investments. The downside, you could lose a lot. And when you're playing with people's retirements, that's pretty risky stuff. And I guess all of what you're saying raises the question is, why are these funds not being run by the smartest investment minds? Why don't they just hire really great investment managers to manage this much money?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, I would say, these large pension systems tend to have very professional staff. And so many of these people who are working either on the staff of these state and local pension funds, they're consultants, they're money managers, these are all financial professionals, but they are overseen by lay people who may not be in a great position to evaluate the advice they're given.
Akyala, when you have this many people's retirements at stake, obviously the federal government takes an interest to make sure that a lot of people don't get stuck out in the cold. You cover the White House. What has the Biden administration, what have past administrations done to oversee all of this money?
I would say even more than just the federal government, but like Joe Biden specifically has a vested interest in keeping union labor leaders happy. He sort of ran his campaign really wanting to get Pennsylvania back after Trump won it in 2016. And so he's really sort of hedged his campaign, his presidency, if you will, on sort of being this person who kind of walks the line between progressive politics, but also appealing to people in the Midwest who've really been hit hard by, economic headwinds. And I think it's important to talk about that as well, because many of these money managers are dealing with the same issues that people on Wall Street in general are dealing with. Last year we saw stocks have the worst year since 2008. And so these are pretty widespread issues. And Biden has been really a consequential economic leader because of these headwinds.
And you have a lot of voters in those states that you just mentioned who have pension plans, are looking toward retirement, wondering if the money's going to be there.
Totally. And Biden sort of, again, he wanted to win Pennsylvania in 2020. And so his first big event was at a Teamsters union hall. So he's really been sort of continuing to do events with union leaders. We saw him in Boston just a couple months ago with union leaders, and then also in Oregon, boosting Democratic candidates there for the midterms. So he's really made an effort to sort of be seen with unions like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and really felt like, he's really prioritized these relationships and these allies, because he wants them to come out and vote for him again, obviously, should he run for re-election in 2024.
Neil, so you describe a situation where you have professional staff but run by amateur directors. Why not just have professionals, period? Why did it happen that amateurs were in charge of this thing?
Well, a lot of this goes back to state law that is many decades old. And I think the logic of this originally was, well, who is most affected by this? And obviously the answer is public workers, your firemen, your police, your teachers, the public employees who are professionals. It might be the treasurer or some other executive in the state government or the city government. And then you had members of the public. And in some cases, these members of the public were sought out for some financial expertise. In many cases, they were not.
How much money are we talking about invested in these public pension funds that you write about?
We are talking about $4 trillion roughly, which is a lot of money. The largest system in the United States is the California Public Employees Retirement System, commonly known as CalPERS, which at the last count had $448 billion in assets.
And so is the idea that the people who aren't professional money managers but are in charge are kind of keeping an eye out on what's happening to be overseers in the sense that they have skin in the game, and so they're just trying to be honest brokers?
Well, as these systems have evolved and the sort of division of labor has mutated as well, what you find is for most of these systems, job number one is deciding how to invest these billions of dollars. However, they also have a lot of other interests. If you are a public employee and you want representation because these pension systems are involved in how long you have to work to have a pension, what is the final formula used to guarantee your pension, and a lot of other labor-related issues. Now, they don't have the authority to actually make all these changes. Often it's state legislatures, but they certainly want to weigh in. They certainly want a seat at the table when these things are being discussed, as well as just the basic administration, sending out the checks, answering the phones, making sure the customer service is good for people who are working or people who are retired so they can get answers. So originally, those were all sort of parts of the responsibility, but more and more, as these pots of money have increased in size and importance, it's become very much an issue of not only overseeing money, but overseeing money that's going into these expensive alternative investments.
My conversation with Akyala, Neil, and Suzanne continues after the break.
For years and years, union workers have been driving trucks from factories to stores, bagging groceries, constructing the buildings and the bridges and the roads that we use every day, and so much more. Imagine if you're not a union worker, you have a good job, you're retiring, about to retire, and you find out your pension plan is going to be cut 60%. Imagine what that does to you.
So we've described how some of these very big pension funds are not run by investment managers. What are the effects of that, Neil? So have they run into trouble as a result of this?
In some cases they have, and I think it would be a bit of a simplification to say, oh, well, they have lay people on their boards, therefore they've run into problems. There have been a multitude of problems. Some of this is demographic. If you look at the number of working employees has gone way down compared to the number of retired employees. You've seen some changes in law, which in some cases have made it more difficult for these pension systems. But clearly the problem of who is ultimately at the top of these systems is a real issue. And yes, they do have professional staff, and yes, they do have outside consultants and money managers, but arguably, it is in the benefit of all those people to increase the complexity, maybe not to reduce the cost. They may not have the same interest as the overall system. You also have a system where if you have representatives for various groups on these boards, they may have an interest in representing the union or the politician who appointed them to the pension board. It might not be that their primary interest is to the whole pension system and making sure that it's run according to, pardon the phrase, fiduciary duty.
Let's put some numbers on this. How big a shortfall have some of these pension funds run into?
It depends on which system you're talking about. Some systems are quite well funded and some systems are almost bankrupt. And there have been a few cities, including Chester, Pennsylvania, which recently declared bankruptcy largely because of its pension obligations and inability to fund them. Overall, I think there's roughly $1 trillion in money that is needed to fulfill promises that is not available. That's $1 trillion out of $4 trillion, which they do have in their kitties. So it's a significant underfunding, roughly 20-25%. And it definitely got worse in 2022 as markets tanked.
To give a sense of scale in terms of underfunding, General Electric in 2019 said it would freeze its plan for 20,000 U.S. employees and shift to a defined contribution plan, a 401k type plan, to help reduce the deficit of its underfunded pension by as much as $8 billion. So a lot of private sector pension plans over the years have frozen their plans, meaning that the people that accrued benefits in those plans will get paid out eventually, but no one else who is joining the company as a new employee will be allowed into the pension plan. And for the most part, people who are still have that pension from, years of former work with the company, they won't accrue any more benefits.
In the private sector, I think about 12% of employees have access to one of these traditional pension plans where you get a monthly check. It's considerably higher in the public sector, and public sector employers have also started to reduce the benefits for new employees. Often by law, they can't cut the benefits of previous employees, existing employees, but if you become a teacher today, you're not going to get the same sweet deal that the teachers a generation ago did.
Right. They might cut your cost of living adjustment, limit that in some way. People used to get retiree medical health care benefits. That was a really juicy perk, and that has been slashed.
And these private pension plans that you describe running into troubles, they are run by professionals. So how much of this has to do with the public pension structure, which is complicated and has a lot of different hands in it, and it just being a very difficult thing to run a pension?
It is a difficult thing to run a pension, and it probably doesn't help that in the private sector you have a law which basically says if a corporate pension plan is significantly underfunded, the company is obligated to put money in. In the public sector, this is all done on the state level, and there is no national law. And in some cases, you've had public sector pensions where the people who estimate how much is needed tell the state legislatures and the governor and so on how much they have to put in, and they are just ignored. So they, just don't put the money in because they have more pressing needs. They need bridges and roads and schools.
Akyala, Neil is talking about how some of these public pensions have run into trouble. One very big one you recently wrote about where Joe Biden had to step in. Can you describe what happened there?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, this Central States Pension Fund was at risk of getting cut up to 60% of those monthly payouts to their members. And so Biden swooped in with this measure in the American Rescue Plan. It's also known as the Butch-Lewis Act, and gave them $36 billion for a long-term period for them to start sort of replenishing their deficit to those users.
So this was like a bailout.
Exactly. And I think bailout is the word that Republicans would use because they really criticized this measure and said, this is not related to the pandemic, as the American Rescue Plan was originally intended. But this was just a way for Biden to please union leaders. They don't want to tell their own members that we're cutting your benefits. The interesting thing about Central States Pension Fund is it's a multi-employer pension fund. So it's a group of multiple companies who are all sort of putting in money towards giving these monthly payments out to their members.
And what kind of workers are in that union?
Mostly labor industries, but trucking is pretty big for Central States. And most of these employees are in the Midwest. Some of the biggest numbers are Michigan, Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, which also happen to be battleground states for Biden as well.
I thought it was also interesting when President Biden announced this, he said that the financial problems Central States Pension was having were due to changes in the economy and attacks on unions. He didn't say anything about how well or poorly they may have been managed.
And I think he doesn't want to upset them, right? He wouldn't say that specifically. But I do think, White House officials are also saying some of these multi-employer pension funds, they've lost employers and workers. So there's less people, actual individuals who are putting money in towards these programs. And there's also been, a loss of some of these industries like trucking, like even the auto industry. So some of these plans used to have maybe 20 companies 20 years ago, and now that's sort of dwindled down to maybe 10 or 12.
We'll be right back. Neil, in your reporting, you show the shortcomings of the way public pensions are run, but everybody was taking a hit on their investments last year. How much can you really lay at their feet versus it just being a really bad year for investing?
Well, I certainly wouldn't blame pension funds because we all had a bad year in the markets. But I would say that it's certainly an open question whether it's you're going to maximize your returns by having people who don't know much about investing at the very top of the pyramid at these public pension funds. I looked at Canada. They have largely replaced these novices with financial experts at their large plans. And I also looked at the Netherlands, where, interestingly, they started a system after the great financial crisis where the directors of public pension funds have to be accredited by their central bank.
Akyala, are there any plans in the U.S. by the Biden administration at all to take a hard look at the way pensions are being run to prevent things like what happened with the Central States Pension Fund?
Well, I think it's important to say that the bailout that the Central States benefited from is available to other multi-employer pension plans as well. So they are able to actually apply for this through the American Rescue Plan to sort of shore up their own pension plan. So that's definitely available still for them. But the Biden administration says that they believe that there was over 200 multi-employer plans that they thought were going to be insolvent by at least 2026. And they said that this program would ensure that at least through 2051, that these plans should be able to stay in place with that assistance. So, there's definitely a lot of money. This $36 billion was just for Central States. And so there has to be at least a couple more $1 billion for these other plans, being that these applications are still open.
Neil and Suzanne, you talked about how taxpayers are kind of creeping up paying the bill for this as more and more money goes toward funding pensions. Are we likely to see pensions looking to more government money in order to help them out? I don't know many people who'd turn it down if it was available. Is that another way that kind of all of us are going to wind up footing the bill here?
I think we already are, and I think that is sort of wrapped inside that number that I gave you, where the amount of payrolls for public organizations that is going to pay pensions rather than salaries has gone up fivefold in recent years. So it's sort of like we're all getting 1,000 cuts, death by 1,000 cuts, or taxes by 1,000 cuts. The public burden certainly is going up.
And that's not just for people with pensions, but if you have just 401k, it's affecting you too in that way.
Absolutely. I mean, your local taxes, your property taxes might go up because of that. I talked to somebody who's on the board of a public plan in Pennsylvania, a state senator, and when she was campaigning, she said that was one of the most common complaints she got when she knocked on doors was people saying the pension system is causing my taxes to go up.
Suzanne, how worried should people who have pensions in general be that the money's going to be there for them?
Well, people who have private pension plans and plans that are frozen, there is, of course, a federal agency, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corp, who is sort of a backstop if a company goes bankrupt and can no longer pay its pension obligations. And so there is that.
But they often don't pay the full amount, right?
Exactly.
They'll get some percentage, and a lot of people have wound up on the very short end of the stick in the last couple decades.
Especially high-income people, because there's a cap on how much they'll pay. So if you are getting a very modest pension, you'll probably get all or most of your pension. If you were, to coin a common example, an airline pilot with a lot of years of experience, you're going to get a big haircut.
Yes, it's definitely not a replacement, and it's incredibly hurtful for people who have planned their entire retirement out very judiciously, but all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, see one huge part of their planning just completely evaporate.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here too and say that this is also like a part of the Biden brand. Like, he calls himself regularly the most pro-labor, the most pro-union president in history. So it's definitely a part of a wider strategy in his administration, sort of almost co-opting Trump's America First, his America First initiatives. And so we had this big CHIPS bill, which is basically an allocation from Congress of about $50 billion to sort of encourage foreign countries to invest in America to create these semiconductors, these little chips that are in cell phones and washing machines, and sort of bring more investment back to America that has been lost to places like China. And so he's definitely sort of using this message that was specifically Trump branded in places like Ohio and Michigan, where Trump, once did really well. And he's sort of trying to kind of re-appeal to those voters. Many people that have felt disenfranchised by the Democratic Party And we've seen him just continuously go on trips to places like Pennsylvania. He's always talking about, where he grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, he's just trying to relate with these communities. He talks about how his grandfather worked in the coal industry. And so it's definitely a part of the Biden persona.
Protecting the incomes of Americans. Of course, it has to be noted that Biden has some work to do shoring up his support among unions after the big railroad strike, where a lot of railroad workers felt like they were not done right by the deal that they eventually had to take.
I think if you look at the politics of this, you can also draw an analogy with the bailout or the reduction that people got for their student loans, where basically we had a system in place and it was supposed to work in some way. And the Biden administration decided, presumably in part due to political calculations, that it was a good idea to offer people a bailout beyond what was written on paper.
And the interesting thing that you bring up about the student loan forgiveness is the same sort of criticism that Republicans had for the bailout is the same ones that they said for the student loan forgiveness plan, which is basically, this is no longer about the pandemic. You're using the pandemic as an excuse to sort of push these big social spending bills and to sort of benefit your constituents. With the student loans program, it's young people. With this bailout, it's union workers and labor leaders. And so it's definitely a continuous criticism that the Republicans have had. And it's certainly a question of whether or how long can Biden say programs are because of the economic situation of the pandemic.
Neil, given the rough time that some of these pensions have been through, do you expect there to be changes in the way they're run to prevent these kinds of shortfalls in the future? Or is this just the way it's going to be?
I think they're kind of ongoing, in part, as we mentioned, the new employees, new teachers and firemen and police are not getting nearly as generous pension benefits as their predecessors did in some cases. You're seeing lots of tinkering around the edges to make this system less costly, because in most states, in most cities, it's virtually impossible to take back promises once you've made them.
Neil Weinberg, Suzanne Woolley, Akyala Gardner, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You can read more reporting from Suzanne Woolley, Neil Weinberg, and Akyala Gardner at Bloomberg.com. Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take, the daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Read today's story and subscribe to our daily newsletter at Bloomberg.com/BigTake. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us with questions or comments to BigTake@Bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is
Vicky Vergolina.
Our senior producer is
Catherine Fink.
Our producers are
Michael Falero
And Mo Barrow.
with additional production support from
Rebecca Chasson.
and
Sam DeBauer.
Rafael Amsili.
is our engineer. Original music by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.